I've always told myself I came out here to find peace. After Emily died, I needed to get away from the pitying looks, the hushed conversations, the casseroles left on my doorstep. People meant well, but every act of kindness reminded me of what I'd lost. So, I sold the house, bought the RV, and hit the road. At first, it was liberating. Me, the open wilderness, and no one to answer to. But now, deep in the boundary waters, with snow piling up outside and the heater sputtering its last breath, I was starting to think I'd made a mistake. The solitude that once felt like freedom now felt like a cage. It had been snowing for 3 days straight. My RV was parked on the edge of a frozen lake, surrounded by a dense forest of pine and birch. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional howl of a wolf or the groan of ice shifting under the snow. I'd chosen this spot for its isolation. No cell service, no people, just me, my thoughts, and the wilderness. But the reality of winter camping was harsher than I'd anticipated. The cold seeped into every crevice of the RV, and the wood I'd gathered for my campfire burned faster than I could replenish it. The first strange thing happened on my second night. I was outside gathering snow to melt for water when I noticed the claw marks. They were etched into the bark of a tree near the RV, deep and deliberate. I frowned, running my gloved fingers over the grooves. Too large for a wolf or a bear. Maybe the previous camper had a dog, I told myself. But the thought didn't sit right. The next morning, I went out to gather firewood and found the deer carcass. It was lying in the snow a few hundred yards from my campsite, its rib cage split open and its entrails strewn across the ground. The strangest part was that no meat had been taken. The kill was fresh, the blood still glistening, but whatever had done this hadn't eaten a bite. Tracks surrounded the carcass, humanoid, but with long clawed toes that sank deep into the snow. My stomach turned. Wolves, I muttered to myself, though I didn't believe it. Wolves don't leave kills untouched. That night, I locked the RV door and kept the fire burning until I fell asleep. The dream started on the third night. In the dream, I was walking through the woods, the trees twisting and groaning around me. The air was bitterly cold, and the snow crunched underfoot. A shadow moved ahead, gaunt and skeletal, with glowing yellow eyes that pierced the darkness. "Ethan," it whispered, its voice like wind through dead leaves. "Ethan, you are not strong enough." I woke with a start, my breath fogging in the freezing air. My heater had given out during the night, leaving the RV an icy tomb. I scrambled out of bed, my hands shaking as I relit the camp stove. When I opened the curtains, I saw footprints in the snow. They led from the edge of the forest to my RV, circling it in a tight spiral before disappearing back into the trees. My heart pounded in my chest. By the fourth day, my food stores were dwindling. I'd rationed carefully, but something had raided my supplies overnight. Packages of dried meat were scattered in the snow, their contents shredded and uneaten. My gas canisters for the backup stove were missing. I searched the RV from top to bottom, but there was no sign of them. The whispers started that afternoon. I was chopping wood when I heard it. A low, guttural growl followed by a voice calling my name. "Ethan!" I froze, my breath visible in the frigid air. The voice was soft, almost melodic, but it sent a chill down my spine. I turned in a slow circle, my axe gripped tightly in my hands. "Who's there?" I shouted. The forest stared back at me, silent and indifferent. That night, I saw it. I was sitting by the fire, my axe within reach, when I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I looked up and saw it standing at the edge of the trees. It was tall, emaciated, and unnervingly silent. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, mottled with patches of frostbitten flesh. Antlers jutted from its skull, their jagged tips catching the firelight. Its eyes glowed yellow, unblinking. I reached for my axe, but the creature didn't move. It just stared at me, its breath fogging in the cold air. "Stay away," I whispered, my voice trembling. The Wendigo tilted its head, as if considering my words. Then, with unnatural speed, it darted forward, stopping just short of the fire. Its clawed hand reached out, dragging across the RV's window, leaving deep gouges in the glass. I stumbled backward, falling into the snow. When I looked up, it was gone. The next morning, I found an old book buried in one of my storage bins. It was a collection of local legends, something I'd picked up at a roadside shop during my travels. Flipping through its pages, I found a chapter on the Wendigo. According to the legend, the Wendigo was a spirit of hunger and greed, preying on those who ventured too far into the wilderness. It drove its victims mad, whispering their fears and failures until they gave in to despair. The book mentioned fire as a potential deterrent, along with the importance of resisting its psychological influence. "You must not succumb," the text read. "To fall into despair is to invite the Wendigo into your soul." That night, the Wendigo came closer. I fortified the RV as best I could, piling firewood around the perimeter and keeping my torch within reach. The whispers grew louder, filling the air with their mournful cadence. "Ethan," the Wendigo hissed, its voice seeping through the walls, "you are weak. You will not survive." I clenched my hands into fists, trying to block it out. "Shut up," I muttered over and over. The fire outside roared, but the heat felt fragile against the encroaching cold. The Wendigo appeared again, its skeletal frame illuminated by the flames. "You are alone," it whispered. "You have always been alone." I grabbed the torch and stumbled outside, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Leave me alone," I shouted, thrusting the flames toward the creature. The Wendigo recoiled, its body flickering like a shadow in the firelight. For a moment, I thought I'd driven it off. Then it lunged. The next moments were a blur. The Wendigo's claws raked across my arm, sending me sprawling into the snow. Pain shot through me, hot and sharp, but I didn't let go of the torch. I swung it wildly, the flames licking at the creature's frostbitten skin. It shrieked, a high, keening wail that pierced the night. The fire roared higher, embers scattering into the darkness. The Wendigo retreated, its glowing eyes fixed on mine. "This is not over," it hissed. Then it disappeared into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. By dawn, the snow had stopped and the road out of the boundary waters was clear enough to drive. I packed up the RV with shaking hands, leaving behind most of my gear. As I drove away, the forest seemed to watch me, its shadows stretching long and dark across the snow. I haven't returned to the wilderness since. Even now, I hear the Wendigo's whispers in my dreams, a haunting reminder of the darkness that lurks at the edge of solitude, but I survived. For now, that's enough. The stillness of Donner Lake was the kind that could suffocate you. I chose this spot deliberately, miles away from the nearest campground, the kind of solitude I had come to crave since my life fell apart. The breakup with Aaron, the corporate job I'd hated but couldn't quit, the apartment I could no longer afford, all of it had unraveled in a matter of months. I thought the wilderness would fix me. It hadn't so far, but the idea kept me going. My RV, a creaky old thing I'd patched up myself, had become my home. It rattled like a tin can on rough roads and the stove barely worked. But it was mine. Donner Lake was meant to be another step on my self-imposed journey of isolation and self-discovery. It wasn't until my second night there that I started to feel like something was watching me. The first day had gone well enough. I parked the RV in a small clearing near the lake where the trees parted just enough to give me a view of the water. I spent the afternoon fishing, though I didn't catch much. The lake was stunning, a perfect mirror reflecting the towering pines and jagged mountains. But as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the water, the beauty of the place began to feel oppressive. By nightfall, my solar generator had decided to give out. I wasn't surprised. It had been acting up for weeks, but the timing was irritating. I rummaged through my supplies, found my backup lantern, and cursed under my breath when I realized the batteries were nearly dead. No big deal, I told myself. I had candles, a campfire, and plenty of matches. The first time I heard the singing, I was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. It started soft, just a hum carried by the breeze. I thought it was my imagination until it grew louder, a melody so beautiful and mournful that it sent a chill down my spine. I stood, straining to hear, but the sound faded almost as quickly as it had come. The lake was calm, the surface as smooth as glass. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a bird or the wind playing tricks on me, and went to bed. That night, I dreamed of Erin. She was standing in the lake, her pale arms stretched toward me. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. I tried to wade in after her, but the water grew thick like molasses, pulling me under. I woke gasping, my sheets damp with sweat. The next morning, I shook off the dream and went about my routine. I cleaned the RV, prepped my fishing gear, and took a short hike around the lake. The air was cool, the scent of pine sharp and invigorating. But something felt off. The bird song I'd heard the day before was gone, replaced by an eerie silence. At the water's edge, I noticed faint footprints in the mud, barefoot, too small to be mine. They led from the lake to the edge of my campsite and disappeared. I stared at them for a long time, my pulse quickening. The nearest road was miles away, and I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived. I decided not to think about it. That night, the singing returned. I was inside the RV flipping through an old travel book I'd picked up at a thrift store when the melody floated through the air. This time, it was louder, clearer, and unmistakably human. I stepped outside, my heart pounding. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint orange light across the clearing. The lake glowed faintly under the moonlight, its surface rippling ever so slightly. "Hello?" I called. The singing stopped. For a moment, all I heard was the rustling of the trees. Then came the splash, a soft, deliberate sound like someone wading into the water. I grabbed my flashlight, flicked it on, and aimed it at the lake. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just the calm, glassy surface, but then I saw it. A shadow beneath the water, moving slowly, deliberately. It was too big to be a fish, too fluid to be a person. I backed away, my breath quick and shallow. The shadow disappeared, and the lake went still again. By the third day, the solitude I'd once craved had turned to dread. I couldn't stop thinking about the singing, the footprints, the shadow. I spent the day repairing the solar generator. more to distract myself than anything else. When I wasn't working, I found myself staring at the lake, my mind replaying the melody over and over. That night, I tried to keep busy. I cooked dinner, read by candlelight, and stoked the fire until it was roaring. But when the singing began again, all my distractions fell away. It was louder now, more insistent. I felt a pull, a strange compulsion to walk toward the lake. I stood at the edge of the water, the melody wrapping around me like a fog. For a moment, I thought I saw her, Erin. She was standing waist deep in the water, her arms outstretched, her lips moving in silent song. "Logan," she whispered. I blinked, and she was gone. That night, I dreamed of drowning. I was sinking into the lake, my lungs burning, the surface growing farther and farther away. The singing surrounded me, the melody twisting into words I couldn't understand. I woke to the sound of scratching at the RV door. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The sound came again, slow and deliberate. Scritch, scritch. I grabbed my flashlight and edged toward the door. My hands trembled as I yanked it open, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. She was there. Her hair was wet, plastered to her pale face. Her eyes glowed faintly, the light reflecting off the surface of the lake. Water dripped from her tattered dress, pooling at her bare feet. "Logan," she said, her voice soft and lilting. I slammed the door and locked it. The next morning, I found a book buried under a pile of gear I hadn't touched in weeks. It was a collection of local ghost stories, something I'd picked up on a whim in a small-town bookstore. I flipped through the pages, desperate for answers, and there it was, a story about a spirit called the Siren of Donner Lake. According to the legend, she was the ghost of a young woman who had died during the Donner Party tragedy. Betrayed and consumed by despair, she lured travelers into the water, where they drowned, joining her in her misery. The book mentioned a way to ward her off: fire and a spoken banishment. The details were vague, but it was all I had. That night, the siren came for me. The fire I'd built earlier hissed and sputtered, its light dimming as water began to pool around the campsite. I stood in the doorway of the RV, clutching a makeshift torch, a branch wrapped in cloth, doused in lighter fluid. The singing grew louder, filling the air, vibrating in my chest. She appeared at the edge of the clearing, her pale figure illuminated by the moonlight. Her eyes locked on mine, and I felt an overwhelming wave of sorrow. "Logan," she whispered, her voice carrying on the wind, "come to me." I stumbled back, clutching the torch like a lifeline. "Stay away!" She stepped closer, the water rising around her feet. Her face was a mask of grief and rage, her voice rising in a haunting crescendo. I lit the torch, the flames roaring to life. The siren flinched, her form flickering like a candle in the wind. I shouted the words from the book, though they felt clumsy and foreign on my tongue. "Leave this place. You have no power here." The siren let out a piercing wail, her body twisting and contorting. The water receded, and she disappeared into the shadows. At dawn, I packed up and left. The RV rattled as I sped down the dirt road, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. I didn't look back. I still hear the siren's song sometimes, faint and distant, in the quiet moments when I'm alone. It reminds me that some places should be left undisturbed, and some scars never truly heal. But I survived, and for now, that's enough. Red River Gorge felt like the perfect escape. A few days surrounded by nature with no emails, no deadlines, just the wild and my camera. I needed this. Chris, my oldest friend, needed it too. Though he wasn't much of a camper, I convinced him to come along. I figured the trip might rekindle our bond. We parked my RV at a quiet trailhead, miles from the crowded campgrounds. As I unloaded my gear, Chris sat on a rock, fiddling with a bottle of water. "I still don't know why I agreed to this," he muttered, squinting at the dense forest. "It's like the trees are closing in." I laughed. "That's the point, Chris. We're off the grid. Fresh air, peace, maybe even some wildlife for me to photograph." "Yeah, great. Bears? Wolves? That sounds peaceful." I ignored him, shouldering my pack. "Come on, it's a short hike. We'll camp near the river." Chris groaned but followed. The trail was narrow, lined with jagged cliffs and thick underbrush. The gorge lived up to its reputation, stunning, rugged, and untamed. But there was something else, too. The air felt heavy. I brushed it off, chalking it up to the humidity. By the time we reached the riverbed, the sun was low on the horizon. I paused, staring. Something was wrong. The river was gone. Where there should have been rushing water, there was only cracked, dry earth. Chris stopped beside me, his expression shifting from annoyance to unease. Evan, are you sure this is the spot?" "Positive," I said, pulling out my map. "The river runs right through here." Chris crouched, touching the dry ground. "Looks like it hasn't been here in years." "That's impossible. It was flowing last week." My voice faltered. It didn't make sense. I felt a flicker of doubt, but quickly buried it. "It's probably seasonal," I lied, unwilling to admit how unsettling this was. "Let's set up camp." As night fell, the forest came alive. Or rather, it didn't. Normally, the woods buzzed with life. Insects, frogs, rustling leaves. But here, the silence was oppressive. Even the wind seemed afraid to move. Chris sat close to the fire, nervously poking at the flames. "Does it feel quiet to you?" "It's remote," I said, fiddling with my camera. "Relax." He snorted. "Sure, relax while nature murders me." "Chris, you're being—" I stopped. My camera had just powered down. Frowning, I turned it back on and reviewed the footage from earlier. That's when I saw it. A figure. It was blurry, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably humanoid. It stood at the edge of the frame, hidden among the trees. I blinked, rewound the clip, and zoomed in. The image distorted, the figure disappearing into static. "What's wrong?" Chris asked, noticing my expression. "Nothing," I said quickly, shutting the camera off. "Just a glitch." The first night passed without sleep. I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps circling our campsite, stopping just outside the firelight. Every time I shone my flashlight, there was nothing. Chris didn't hear it. He was snoring in his tent, blissfully unaware. The next morning, we met Laura. She appeared suddenly, stepping out from the trees as we packed our gear. Her boots were worn, her hair tied back beneath a bandana. She looked like she belonged here, unlike Chris, who flinched at the sight of her. "Morning," she said, her tone friendly but guarded. "Didn't expect to see anyone this far out." "We're camping," I said, forcing a smile. "Doing some photography." She nodded, her dark eyes scanning the dry riverbed. "Strange, isn't it? This river used to run year-round." "You've been here before?" Chris asked. "A few times," she said, "but I stay on the main trails now. This area's different." "Different how?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. She hesitated. "You've heard the stories, right? about the Wendigo?" Chris groaned. "Oh, great! A ghost story. That's what I need." "It's not a ghost," Laura said sharply. "It's a spirit, a creature. The Wendigo appears when something's wrong, when the land's been disrespected or people have gone too far. It preys on greed and hunger." I laughed, trying to ease the tension. "Well, good thing we're not greedy." Laura didn't laugh. She looked at me, then at Chris. "Be careful. Things can change quickly out here." Laura's warning lingered as we hiked deeper into the forest. Chris was unusually quiet, glancing over his shoulder every few minutes. I tried to shake off my unease, focusing on setting up new motion sensor cameras. But as I reviewed the footage, the images disturbed me. The cameras captured blurry shapes, elongated, humanoid figures skirting the edges of the frame. I didn't tell Chris. He was already on edge. That night, the forest came alive with sounds, faint growls, snapping twigs, and something that sounded like breathing. I stayed by the fire, gripping my flashlight while Chris sat rigid beside me. "I heard it," he whispered. "Tell me you heard it." "I heard it," I admitted. "Stay close." At some point, Chris stood abruptly. "I'm going to the RV." "No way," I said. "It's too far, and—" But he was already walking into the darkness. I chased after him, my flashlight barely piercing the gloom. "Chris, stop!" He turned, his face pale. "Didn't you hear her? Laura's voice. She's calling for help." I stared at him. "Chris, Laura's not here." But he wasn't listening. He kept moving, faster now, until I grabbed his arm and yanked him back. "Listen to me!" I shouted. "You're not thinking clearly." Chris looked at me, confused, as if waking from a dream. I thought I heard." The growling returned, closer this time. The foul stench of decay filled the air, making my stomach churn. Something moved in the shadows, too fast to see. "Run," I whispered. We sprinted back to camp, but the fire had died, the woods pressed in around us, suffocating and silent. Then came the mimicry. "Chris!" a voice called, identical to mine. He froze, staring into the trees. "Evan, what?" "It's not me," I hissed. "Don't listen to it." The voice came again, closer. "Chris, help me." Chris grabbed my arm, his face white with fear. "What is that?" The answer came with a snap of branches. A figure stepped into the clearing, a gaunt, elongated humanoid with glowing eyes and claws that gleamed in the faint moonlight. The smell of rot was overwhelming. It was the Wendigo. I shoved Chris toward the trail. "Run! Don't stop!" The Wendigo moved with unnatural speed, circling us, its glowing eyes locked on Chris. It growled, a guttural, bone-chilling sound. Chris tripped, falling hard, and I turned back, swinging my flashlight wildly. The light caught the creature's face, twisted and skeletal, its lips curling back to reveal jagged teeth. It flinched, momentarily blinded, and I used the distraction to drag Chris to his feet. We stumbled through the forest, the Wendigo's footsteps echoing behind us. I didn't know where we were going. I just knew we had to keep moving. We found Laura at the edge of the forest. She had a torch in one hand and a look of grim determination on her face. "It's here, isn't it?" she said. I nodded, gasping for breath. "What do we do?" "Fire," she said. "It's the only thing that weakens it." Chris was shaking, his face pale. "We're gonna die out here." "No, we're not," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "We fight." Laura handed me a torch, lighting it with hers. The Wendigo emerged moments later, its movements jerky and unnatural. It circled us, growling, its eyes gleaming with hunger. "Hold your ground," Laura said. "Don't let it separate us." The creature lunged faster than I could react. Laura swung her torch, the flames grazing its side. It screeched, recoiling, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. Chris panicked, dropping his torch and bolting into the woods. "Chris, no!" I shouted, but it was too late. The Wendigo turned, chasing after him. "Stay here," I told Laura, running after my friend. I found Chris slumped against a tree, his breathing shallow. The Wendigo stood over him, its claws poised. I didn't think, I just acted, swinging my torch with all my strength. The flames caught its arm and it howled, retreating into the shadows. Chris looked up at me, his eyes glassy. "Evan," he whispered, "it's inside my head. I can't stop it." "You're fine," I said, pulling him to his feet. "We're getting out of here." We made it back to Laura, but Chris wasn't the same. He muttered incoherently, his eyes darting around like he was seeing things I couldn't. "We have to go," Laura said. "Now." The three of us ran, the Wendigo's growls following us all the way to the RV. When we finally reached it, I shoved Chris inside and slammed the door. Laura and I collapsed, exhausted. But something felt wrong. Chris was silent, sitting in the corner, his head bowed. I approached cautiously. "Chris?" I said. He looked up, smiling, a cold, unnatural smile. "You can't escape," he said, his voice distorted. The Wendigo's reflection gleamed in his eyes. Ending. We drove away, leaving the gorge behind, but the claw marks on the RV's side were a stark reminder of what we'd faced. Chris didn't speak again, his smile frozen, his eyes distant. As we crossed the state line, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The Wendigo stood at the edge of the forest, watching us. We survived, but I'll never go back. Some places aren't meant to be disturbed. I never thought I'd regret planning this trip. It was supposed to be simple. A weekend in the Smokies, reconnecting with my sister Ellie and our friends, Marissa and Liam. A remote trail, a bit of camping, and no distractions. But as I sit in this RV, claw marks still etched into its side, my hands won't stop shaking. I keep replaying every moment, trying to pinpoint where it all went wrong. It started as an adventure. We parked the RV at a secluded trailhead, miles away from the crowded campsites, and unloaded our gear. The plan was to hike 5 miles in, set up camp, and spend 2 nights surrounded by nothing but nature. Ellie grumbled as I handed out the supplies. "Why are we packing so light, David?" she asked, adjusting her backpack. "This is your fault if I freeze to death." "You won't freeze," I said, rolling my eyes. "It's supposed to be a challenge. You wanted to get off the grid, right?" "Sure," Liam chimed in, balancing his gear awkwardly. "Nothing screams relaxation like walking into the wilderness with barely enough stuff to survive." Marissa smiled at him. "Don't worry, I brought extras," she said, patting her pack. "Sage, crystals, and my talisman, just in case." Ellie snorted. "Right, because ghosts and boogeymen are a real threat out here." "You shouldn't mock things you don't understand," Marissa said softly. I kept quiet, letting them bicker as we hiked into the woods. The Smokies were beautiful, draped in their namesake mist. Sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, dappling the trail with golden patches. but the deeper we went, the quieter it became. No bird song, no rustling leaves, just our footsteps crunching over the dirt. We reached the clearing by late afternoon. It was perfect, a flat space surrounded by tall trees, with a creek nearby for water. I helped Liam pitch the tents, though one of the poles snapped when he handled it too roughly. He ended up sharing with Ellie and Marissa. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, I lit the campfire and passed around the food. The warmth and light felt comforting. Even Ellie started to relax, teasing Liam for his lack of camping skills. "You didn't even know how to set up the stove," she said, grinning. "Hey, I'm learning," he shot back. "Besides, I'm here for the company, not the survival skills." We laughed, and for a moment, everything felt normal. But that night, the woods didn't let us forget where we were. The first sign came when we heard it. Knocking sounds, faint but deliberate. At first, I thought it was an animal, but the rhythm was too consistent. Knock, 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 then silence. Liam sat up, peering into the darkness. "What the hell was that?" "Probably just a woodpecker," Ellie said, though her voice wavered. Marissa's face had gone pale. "It's not a woodpecker," she whispered. "That's a warning." "A warning?" Ellie scoffed. "Come on, Marissa." "She's right," I said, trying to stay calm. "It's probably nothing, but everyone stay close to the fire." We stayed up late, listening. The knocking came and went, moving closer, then farther away. Around midnight, it stopped. I convinced myself it was just the wind, though my gut told me otherwise. The next morning, things got worse. When I stepped out of my tent, the first thing I noticed was the ground. Deep gouges marred the soil around our camp, like something with claws had raked through it. There were no tracks, no signs of animals, just those unnerving marks. "What the hell did this?" Ellie asked, crouching to inspect them. "Bear, maybe?" I said, though I didn't believe it. Marissa shook her head. "No, this is deliberate. Look how precise it is." Ellie rolled her eyes. "Oh, let me guess. Another sign from the spirits?" Marissa didn't answer. Instead, she dug through her pack, searching for something. A moment later, she froze. "My talisman," she said, her voice trembling. "It's gone." "Maybe you dropped it," Liam offered. "No," she snapped. "I kept it in a zipped pocket. It's gone." We spent the morning checking the camp, but the talisman wasn't there. By noon, I decided we needed a distraction. We followed a nearby trail, hoping to find a scenic overlook Marissa had read about. The hike was uneventful, but the tension between us lingered. Liam tried to lighten the mood, cracking jokes, but even he seemed uneasy. The second night was worse. It started with Liam swearing he saw someone standing at the edge of the firelight. A woman, tall and thin, her face obscured by shadows. When I shone my flashlight, there was nothing there. "Probably just a trick of the light," Ellie said, though her hands were trembling. We settled back into the tents, but sleep didn't come. Around 2 a.m., I heard it, knocking again, closer this time. I stepped outside, shining my flashlight into the trees. The beam caught something, a shape, pale and humanoid, ducking behind a tree. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking. No answer. The knocking stopped. By morning, the group was unraveling. Liam was jumpy, refusing to leave the camp. Marissa was frantic, insisting we were being stalked by something ancient and evil. Even Ellie, ever the skeptic, seemed rattled. "Okay," I said, trying to keep control. "We'll break camp and head back to the RV. We're done here." But when we packed up and started hiking, we realized something terrifying. The trail had changed. The landmarks we'd passed before were gone, replaced by unfamiliar terrain. It was as if the forest itself had shifted. "This isn't possible," Ellie said, staring at the map. "We've only gone a mile. Where's the creek?" Marissa looked at me, her eyes filled with fear. "It's Spearfinger," she said. "She's toying with us." "Spearfinger?" I repeated. "An old Cherokee legend," she explained. "A stone witch who can shapeshift. She lures people into the woods and kills them by stealing their livers." "That's ridiculous," Ellie snapped. "We're just lost. This isn't some fairy tale." But deep down, I knew Marissa was right. Something unnatural was happening. That evening, Liam vanished. One moment he was with us, muttering about how he hated the forest. The next, he was gone. We called his name, searched the surrounding trees, but there was no sign of him. An hour later, he returned, stumbling into camp. His face was pale, his eyes distant. He didn't speak, just sat by the fire, staring blankly. "Liam?" I asked, shaking his shoulder. "Where did you go?" He didn't answer. Ellie backed away. "Something's wrong with him." Marissa grabbed my arm. "That's not Liam," she whispered. Before I could respond, Liam looked up. His lips curled into a smile, a cold, unnatural expression, and then he spoke, his voice distorted. "You can't escape." Panic set in. Marissa lit sage, waving the smoke around the camp. "It's her," she said. "She's taken his form." Ellie grabbed a stick from the fire, holding it like a weapon. "Stay back." Liam, or whatever had taken his place, laughed. It was a hollow, chilling sound. Then he lunged. Marissa screamed, throwing salt at him. The figure recoiled, its skin bubbling like acid. It let out an inhuman shriek before collapsing into the dirt. When we looked again, Liam was gone. In his place were claw marks in the earth, leading into the darkness. We didn't sleep. The forest was alive with sounds, whispers, footsteps, the faint knocking that haunted us from the beginning. Marissa insisted we perform a ritual to weaken Spearfinger. She burned her talisman and scattered the ashes around the camp, chanting prayers under her breath. At dawn, we ran. The forest seemed to fight us, trees looming closer, shadows darting just out of sight. But finally, mercifully, we reached the RV. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, watching us. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and her hand ended in a sharp, stone-like spear. We survived, but I can still feel her presence like she's waiting, watching, and I know we'll never really escape. I'd been driving for hours, the narrow desert highway stretching endlessly in front of me. The sun was a golden orb sinking behind the mesas, painting the sky in fiery hues. My RV rattled as the pavement turned to dirt, the road leading me deeper into the vast, silent expanse of Canyon Hollow. This was where I wanted to be. Alone, surrounded by nothing but red rock and the occasional shriek of a hawk. I needed to clear my head, to find some kind of peace, or at least distraction. 6 months had passed since the accident, but the guilt was as raw as ever. I should have been more careful. I couldn't escape that thought, no matter how far I drove. Canyon Hollow was famous for its petroglyphs, remnants of an ancient people whose art told stories of life, death, and something in between. It was also infamous for its mysteries, tales of settlers who vanished, of travelers who never made it out. But I didn't believe in that sort of thing. History was history, nothing more. I pulled into the campground as dusk settled, parking near the edge of the canyon. There were only 2 other campers, an older couple in a beat-up RV several spots down. They waved as I stepped out, and I gave them a nod. The silence of the desert was almost unnerving, the kind of quiet that pressed on your ears. I shook it off and set up camp, promising myself a good night's rest before exploring the next day. That first night, I dreamed of the accident. I was back on the ridge, the rocks crumbling beneath my feet. I heard Alex shouting, his voice raw with panic. My hands reached out for him, but I wasn't fast enough. I woke up drenched in sweat, my chest tight. The silence outside was absolute, broken only by the occasional creak of the RV as it settled into the cool desert air. I stepped outside for some fresh air. The moon hung high, casting long shadows over the red rocks. I could see the older couple's RV, their lights off. Beyond them, the canyon stretched out, an ocean of darkness. That's when I heard it. A faint voice carried on the wind. "Ethan!" I froze, my heart pounding. The voice was faint but unmistakable. It was Alex's. Impossible, I told myself. Just a trick of the wind. I stood there for a moment, staring into the void before retreating to the safety of the RV. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease. The sun was bright, and the desert looked almost friendly in the daylight. I packed a bag with water and snacks and set off to explore the petroglyphs. The trail was rugged, winding through narrow canyons and open plains dotted with junipers. The carvings appeared in clusters, etched into the stone with astonishing precision. Animals, spirals, figures locked in what looked like dances or battles. Then I found the symbols. Unlike the other carvings, these were jagged and erratic, spirals that twisted into themselves like whirlpools. They didn't fit with the rest of the art. Standing there, I felt a chill despite the sun. It wasn't just the symbols, it was the silence. No birds, no wind, just me and the rocks. When I got back to camp, the older couple's RV was gone. At first I thought that they'd left while I was out, but their spot was wrong. Their folding chairs were still there, along with a cooler and a half-empty coffee mug. Their fire pit had ashes that were still warm. I walked over, calling out, but no one answered. The RV keys were sitting on the folding table as if they'd just stepped away for a moment. A heavy unease settled over me, but I convinced myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe they'd gone for a hike. Maybe they'd gotten a ride into town. But as night fell, the unease turned into something closer to fear. The wind picked up after sundown, howling through the canyon like a living thing. I sat inside the RV, trying to focus on anything but the emptiness outside. That's when I noticed the journal. It was sitting on my passenger seat, leather-bound and worn. I hadn't seen it there before. My pulse quickened as I flipped it open. The handwriting was shaky but legible, the entries chronicling the travels of someone who had camped here before me. At first, the notes were mundane, descriptions of the canyon, complaints about the heat. But as the entries went on, they grew darker. "Something is out there. I see shadows at night, faces in the mirrors." I thought I was alone, but I'm not. They're watching me. The last entry sent a chill down my spine. "Don't let them in. No matter what you hear, don't let them in." I snapped the journal shut, my hands trembling. The RV groaned as the wind buffeted it, and for a moment, I thought I heard a knock at the door. Just the wind, I told myself. But then it came again, louder. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaken. No answer. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the door. The desert stretched out before me, empty and silent. But then I saw them, footprints in the dirt leading from the ridge down to my RV. My stomach turned. That night I barricaded the door with everything I could find. Sleep was out of the question. The whispers started around midnight, faint at first, then louder. They called my name, voices I recognized but couldn't place. Alex was one of them. I covered my ears, rocking back and forth until the sun came up. The next day, I decided to leave. I packed up as fast as I could and started the engine, relief flooding me when it roared to life. But as I drove toward the exit, the road twisted and looped, always bringing me back to the campground. I tried every direction, but it was no use. It was like the canyon wouldn't let me go. Desperation drove me back to the petroglyphs. I followed the spirals, hoping they held some kind of answer. The silence was crushing now, the air heavy with dread. And then I saw it. A wagon train, fully intact, crossing the canyon in the distance. At first, I thought it was a mirage, but as I got closer, the figures became clearer. Men, women, and children in 19th century clothing. Their faces were pale, their movements slow and deliberate. I shouted, waving my arms, but they didn't react. As I approached, they vanished, leaving only skeletal remains of wagons and rusted tools in their wake. That night, they came for me. I sat in the RV, knife in hand, as shadows moved outside. The voices were louder now, pleading and accusing all at once. "Why did you leave me, Ethan?" Alex's voice cut through the din, filled with anger and sorrow. The windows fogged as hollow faces pressed against the glass, their empty eye sockets weeping black tears. They began to bang on the walls, the door shaking on its hinges. "You can't hide," they whispered. "You belong here with us." I thought of the journal, of its warning not to let them in, but the voices grew louder, more insistent, filling my head with guilt and regret. I clutched the knife, my knuckles white. Then I remembered the spirals. The petroglyphs had to mean something, a way out, a key. I grabbed Alex's compass, the only keepsake I had of him, and bolted from the RV. The shadows followed, their whispers echoing through the canyon. I reached the spirals and fell to my knees, holding the compass above the carvings. "I'm sorry," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I'm so sorry, Alex." The air grew still. The shadows stopped moving. One by one, they dissolved into the canyon mist, their voices fading into silence. The compass grew warm in my hand before falling still. The road was clear the next morning. I didn't question it. I drove until the canyon was a distant memory, the horizon opening up before me. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that they're still watching. That someday, somewhere, the whispers will start again. I pulled my RV into the secluded campsite just as the rain started. The drops pinged against the roof like tiny bullets, creating a rhythm that, under other circumstances, might have been calming. But as I stepped out into the chill, I felt anything but calm. The Columbia River Gorge was supposed to be beautiful, a place where you could lose yourself in nature and leave the chaos of the world behind. That's what I told myself when I agreed to take this assignment, a photography spread on the rare owls that called the gorge home. It wasn't just work, it was a way to connect with the wilderness my dad had loved so much. He'd been gone 3 months now, and I hadn't yet figured out how to deal with the silence he left behind. The gorge felt like a fitting tribute. The kind of place he'd have taken me as a kid, pointing out tracks in the dirt and birds in the canopy. But as I stood there, staring at the dark forest ahead, I felt more alone than ever. The first day wasn't so bad. The rain let up by mid-morning, and I managed to find a good spot to set up my camera near one of the gorge's many waterfalls. The cascading water was mesmerizing, its roar drowning out the world, and for a while I forgot about everything else. That was until I heard the whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the trees, but it had a rhythm to it, a cadence, words I couldn't make out but that felt intentional. I scanned the area, half expecting to see someone nearby, but there was no one. "Just your imagination," I muttered to myself, but the words didn't convince me. That night, as I reviewed the photos I'd taken, the rain came back with a vengeance. The RV rocked slightly in the wind, and the forest outside the windows turned into an impenetrable wall of black. I tried to focus on the images, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One shot in particular stood out, a photo of the waterfall. In the corner, faint but unmistakable, was a shadowy figure standing among the trees. I told myself it was a trick of the light, just the contrast of the water spray against the dark forest. But then I heard the footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and heavy. At first, they seemed far off, but they grew louder, closer, circling the RV. I turned off the light and peered out the window, but all I saw was the rain. The footsteps stopped, but the unease stayed with me long after I'd crawled into bed. The next day, I ventured deeper into the forest, determined to shake off the previous night's paranoia. The gorge was breathtaking, its trails winding through dense greenery and past cliffs that offered stunning views of the river below. I lost myself in the work, snapping shots of moss-covered rocks and misty trees. That's when I found the carvings. They were etched into a cluster of boulders, spiraling symbols that looked ancient. I ran my fingers over one, noting how smooth it felt, as if it had been worn down by centuries of wind and rain. At the center of the largest carving was a stone, perfectly round and black as night. It almost seemed to pulse when I touched it. I pocketed the stone without thinking. Something about it felt significant, though I couldn't explain why. The forest felt heavier on the way back to the RV, the air thick with humidity and something else I couldn't name. As I neared camp, I spotted a figure in the distance. My breath caught in my throat. It was a man, standing perfectly still, facing away from me. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing. The man didn't move. I took a step closer, but as I did, the figure dissolved into the shadows. My pulse quickened. I hurried back to the RV, locking the door behind me. That night, the rain stopped, but the forest outside was anything but quiet. The whispers came back, louder this time, accompanied by faint laughter. And then I heard his voice. "Ethan?" It was my dad, clear as day. "Dad?" I said aloud, my voice trembling. "Come here," the voice beckoned. It was coming from outside, pulling me toward the trees. I froze, my hand hovering over the door handle. A part of me knew it couldn't be real, knew that opening that door would be a mistake. But the voice was so familiar, so comforting. It took every ounce of willpower I had to stay inside. The next morning, I woke to find the RV surrounded by a circle of stones. They were identical to the one I'd pocketed, each one perfectly smooth and black. My stomach dropped. As I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me. The forest was silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness. And then I saw it. It stood on a rock, its form shrouded in shadow. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs too long, its posture too still. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in a dying fire. "Leave what you took," the figure said. Its voice was gravelly, deep, and laced with menace. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. What are you?" The figure tilted its head as if studying me. "Leave what you took," it repeated before fading into the trees. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I considered leaving, but the RV's battery was dead, and the nearest ranger station was miles away. I was trapped. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. The shadows outside the RV seemed to move, twisting and contorting into impossible shapes. I clutched the black stone in my hand, suddenly certain it was the key to everything. "Is this what you want?" I shouted, stepping outside and holding the stone aloft. The Sandman appeared again, its glowing eyes fixed on me. "Leave what you took," it said, its voice echoing through the gorge. I threw the stone into the forest, my chest heaving. The Sandman didn't move. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing toward the cliffs. "Come," it whispered. I didn't follow. Instead, I bolted back into the RV and slammed the door. The Sandman's form loomed outside, but it didn't approach. Instead, it simply stared, its eyes burning into me. Somehow, I managed to jumpstart the RV the next morning. As I drove out of the gorge, the weight that had pressed on me for days began to lift. But the memory of the Sandman stayed with me, its whispers echoing in my mind. Weeks later, as I developed my photos, I found something chilling. In one shot, a stunning image of an owl perched on a branch, there was a shadow in the background. Tall, humanoid, with glowing eyes. I haven't returned to the gorge since. But sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I hear it again. Leave what you took. People think living on the road in an RV is freedom. And maybe it is, for the right kind of person. For me, it was less about freedom and more about necessity. My marriage had imploded 6 months ago, leaving me with a pile of bills and a suffocating apartment I could barely afford. So, I sold what I could, bought an old RV off Craigslist, and decided to hit the road. I wasn't looking for adventure. I was looking for peace. Somewhere I could just be. That's how I ended up in Lost Creek Wilderness in Colorado, a place that felt as isolated as I wanted to be. I'd read about it online, miles of granite formations, dense forests, and a winding creek that lived up to its name by disappearing underground only to reappear miles later. It sounded perfect. I parked my RV in a clearing near the creek. There were no other campers around, not a tent, not a car, just me and the wilderness. The silence was almost too much at first. No hum of traffic, no distant sounds of people, just the wind and the occasional rustle of leaves. I spent my first day hiking and fishing. The trail was rugged but beautiful, and the trout in the creek were practically jumping into my hands. As I cooked one over my campfire that evening, I finally felt a flicker of what I'd been chasing. Contentment. The kind that comes when you're far enough from everything to forget your troubles. But that night, I noticed the silence again. It was different now, oppressive, the kind that presses on your chest and makes every little noise stand out. My RV creaked in the cold mountain air, the sound loud enough to make me flinch. I told myself it was nothing, just the natural sounds of the forest. But then came the footsteps. I sat bolt upright in bed, holding my breath. They were slow, deliberate, circling the RV. A bear, I thought, or maybe a deer. But they sounded too heavy for that, too purposeful. I grabbed the flashlight from beside my bed and peered out the window. Nothing. Just the dark silhouettes of trees and the faint glimmer of moonlight on the creek. The footsteps stopped. The silence returned, but it was worse now, charged like the air before a storm. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching the flashlight like it was a weapon. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. The forest could play tricks on your ears. Still, as I stepped outside, something felt off. My hiking boots, which I'd left neatly by the RV door, were gone. I searched the clearing, my frustration growing. I finally found them downstream, soaked and muddy, wedged between two rocks. I hadn't been near the creek since the day before, and even if I had, why would I throw my boots in the water? I tried to laugh it off, convincing myself it was my own stupidity, but the unease stayed with me. Later, while hiking a different trail, I came across something stranger, carvings on the rocks near the creek. Deep, jagged lines that formed symbols I didn't recognize. They didn't look natural, but they weren't clean enough to be man-made either. They gave me the same tight-chested feeling I'd had the night before, like I wasn't supposed to be there. The electrical problems started that evening. The RV's lights flickered as I cooked dinner, and the heater sputtered before going dead completely. I wasn't too worried. I was a mechanic by trade and could usually patch things up. But as I worked on the wiring, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. Just the woods, dark and endless. I told myself to get a grip, but the feeling didn't go away. When I stepped outside to grab a tool from the storage compartment, I saw something that stopped me cold. A trail of stones leading from the RV to the creek. Perfectly spaced, almost deliberate. I hadn't put them there. That night, the footsteps came back, louder this time and accompanied by something else, a scraping sound like nails on metal. My heart pounded as I grabbed the flashlight and opened the RV door. The beam of light swept across the clearing, catching only trees and shadows. But then, just at the edge of the woods, I saw it. A figure. It stood motionless, half hidden behind a tree. Its limbs were too long, its shape all wrong, and its eyes, God, its eyes, glowed faintly in the dark, reflecting the light like an animal's. My throat went dry as it stepped forward, just enough for me to see the unnatural way it moved, like it didn't fully understand how to walk. I slammed the door and locked it, my hands shaking. The footsteps stopped. The silence returned, but it wasn't comforting. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. The next morning, I found claw marks on the RV door. Deep, jagged gouges that hadn't been there the day before. My first instinct was to leave, to pack up and drive until I reached the nearest town. But when I tried to start the RV, the engine wouldn't turn over. The battery was dead, drained completely overnight. Panic began to creep in, but I forced it down. I could fix this. I'd fixed worse. I spent the day trying to jump-start the engine with a makeshift generator I'd rigged up, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Every time I glanced toward the trees, I half expected to see the figure again. That afternoon, I found an old journal tucked into a crevice near the creek. The leather cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age. Inside were handwritten entries from someone who had camped here before me. The first few pages were normal, notes about the weather, the scenery, but the tone shifted quickly. "There's something in the woods. It doesn't want me here. I see it at night, watching from the trees." The entries grew more frantic, the handwriting messier. The last one sent a chill through me. "It's in the clearing. I can't leave. If you find this, go. Leave while you still can." That night, the thing came closer. I was sitting by the fire, knife in hand, when I saw it again. This time it didn't stay at the edge of the trees. It stepped into the clearing, its movement slow and deliberate. The firelight illuminated its form, a twisted, skeletal figure with impossibly long arms and legs. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its face, it didn't have a face, just smooth, featureless skin and those terrible glowing eyes. I stood frozen, every instinct screaming at me to run, but where would I go? The RV wouldn't start, and the nearest road was miles away. The thing moved closer, its limbs jerking unnaturally, as if pulled by invisible strings. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed a dry branch from the fire and swung it, the flames flaring as they caught the air. The creature hissed, a guttural, inhuman sound, and backed away, retreating into the shadows. I didn't sleep that night. At dawn, I made one last attempt to jumpstart the RV. My hands were trembling as I connected the wires, silently praying for the engine to turn over. When it finally roared to life, I almost cried. I didn't even bother packing up. I left the campsite as it was, speeding down the dirt road with the RV shaking beneath me. My heart didn't stop racing until I hit pavement, and even then, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see those glowing eyes chasing me. It's been months since that trip, and I haven't set foot in the wilderness since. The RV still has claw marks on the door, a reminder of how close I came to whatever that thing was. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I feel it again. That oppressive silence, the sense of being watched. And sometimes, just out of the corner of my eye, I think I see it, waiting, watching. Maybe I never really left Lost Creek. Maybe part of me is still there, standing in the clearing, staring into the trees. Or maybe it followed me. I'd always loved the desert, its silence, its emptiness. There was something honest about it. No noise, no distractions, just raw, open space. After my divorce, when the walls of my apartment started to feel like they were closing in, I decided I needed the desert more than ever. I packed my RV, grabbed my camera, and headed for Joshua Tree National Park. I told myself it was for a freelance article about solitude and healing, but really, I just needed to get away. The job I'd poured my life into had laid me off 6 months ago, and Emily, my ex-wife, left shortly after. Too much stress, she said, too much distance. The only thing I had left was this trip and the hope that being alone out here would give me clarity. I arrived mid-afternoon, the sun blazing overhead, painting the iconic Joshua trees in long, twisted shadows. The campsite I chose was remote, miles from the nearest ranger station or marked trails. Perfect. I needed to be alone, needed to clear my head. The first day passed uneventfully. I hiked the trails, snapping photos of the rock formations and alien-like trees. The desert had a way of humbling you, making your problems feel insignificant against its vastness. By the time I returned to the RV, the sun was setting, and I felt the kind of tired that only comes from honest exertion. That night, the stars were incredible. I set up my camera to capture the Milky Way, listening to the wind whistle through the rocks. It wasn't until I climbed into bed that I heard it, the faint sound of something moving outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, but the sound wasn't quite right. It was slow and deliberate, circling the RV. I lay there, heart pounding, until the noise stopped. The next morning, I stepped outside and froze. There were handprints on the RV windows, large, too large to be human, and smeared like someone had dragged their fingers through the dust. I swallowed hard, trying to rationalize it. Maybe a trick of the wind, maybe vandals, but I'd seen no other vehicles, no other campers. I spent the day hiking further into the park, trying to shake the unease. The desert didn't feel as friendly anymore. The wind seemed to carry whispers, faint and unintelligible, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I spotted the lights. At first, I thought it was another camper. 2 small orbs glowing faintly in the distance. But they moved in a way that no human could, darting between rocks, hovering for a moment, then disappearing and reappearing somewhere else. I watched them for hours, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light, until exhaustion finally pulled me to sleep. On the 3rd day, things escalated. I'd hiked a few miles from the RV when I heard my name. "Ryan!" It was faint, carried on the wind, but unmistakable. I froze, scanning the horizon. There was no one there. "Ryan." This time, it was louder. It sounded like Emily, her voice soft and teasing, the way she used to call me when she was trying to coax me out of bed on lazy mornings. My chest tightened. "Who's there?" I shouted. The wind answered with silence. I returned to the RV, shaken. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard laughter outside. Emily's laughter. My hands trembled as I clutched the flashlight, too terrified to look out the window. The laughter faded, replaced by a faint tapping on the RV door. I didn't sleep. The 4th day, I noticed something odd. On my hike, I found a small circle of stones, perfectly arranged in a clearing. It wasn't the first one I'd seen. There had been others, smaller, scattered near my campsite, but this one felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. At its center lay a smooth, black stone, polished as if it had been handled often. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand. It felt warm, unnaturally so, as if it had been sitting in the sun, though it was shaded by the surrounding rocks. I pocketed it without thinking. By the time I returned to the RV, the wind had picked up, carrying with it a strange, low hum. It was almost imperceptible, but it burrowed into my mind, making it hard to think. That night, the lights returned, brighter this time and closer. I tried to ignore them, but the tapping on the windows started again, more insistent. When I finally summoned the courage to look, my breath caught in my throat. A figure stood just beyond the glow of my flashlight, tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long. Its eyes glowed like the orbs I'd seen the night before, and its head tilted as if studying me. I slammed the blinds shut and locked the doors. The tapping continued until dawn. I spent the next day in a haze, my mind racing. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen, but there was no explanation. I thought about leaving, but the RV's battery had died during the night. The solar charger was slow, and I was trapped until it charged enough to start the engine. That night, the Sandman came closer. I heard it before I saw it, a low, gravelly whisper that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. "Leave what you took." I sat in the RV, clutching my flashlight as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. When I peeked out the window, it was there again, crouched on a rock, its glowing eyes fixed on me, its limbs stretched unnaturally, its form shifting and blending with the jagged landscape. "Leave what you took," it repeated, louder this time. I didn't understand. What had I taken? I finally remembered the black stone in my pocket. It sat on the RV counter now, a small, innocent thing that suddenly felt ominous. Was this what it wanted? Gathering my courage, I grabbed the stone and stepped outside. The desert was unnervingly quiet, the usual sounds of nocturnal animals absent. The Sandman stood a few feet away, its eyes blazing like fire. "I'm leaving it," I shouted, throwing the stone onto the ground. "Take it." The Sandman didn't move. Instead, it tilted its head again, as if considering me. Then, without a sound, it dissolved into the shadows, leaving me alone under the vast desert sky. I didn't sleep that night. The moment the RV's battery held enough charge, I started the engine and drove. The desert blurred past me, the oppressive silence giving way to the hum of the tires on the pavement. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. When I finally looked back at the photos I'd taken, my stomach turned. In several of them, I saw it, a shadow in the distance, its glowing eyes watching me. I wrote my article about Joshua Tree, about the beauty and solitude of the desert. But I left out the Sandman. Some things, I realized, are better left unsaid. And yet, sometimes at night I hear it again. A low whisper carried on the wind. "Leave what you took." It started as an adventure. My younger brother Mark and I had planned this RV trip through the Black Hills for weeks. The forest called to me with its untamed beauty, rolling hills, dense pines, and endless trails. For Mark, it was less about nature and more about escape. He needed a break from the chaos of city life. We arrived mid-afternoon and parked the RV in a quiet clearing far from the main campground. Mark had grumbled the entire drive, but I shrugged it off. That was Mark, a constant critic but someone who meant well in his own way. "You're sure about this spot?" he asked, hopping out of the RV and surveying the area. "It's perfect," I said. "Remote, quiet, and I'll get some amazing shots at dawn. Just wait." Mark rolled his eyes. "Great. I'll wait while the wolves circle us." I ignored him, unloading the gear. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the faint hum of wind through the trees felt almost alive. But there was something else too, something I couldn't quite place. A heaviness. I shook it off as excitement. After all, this was what I lived for. Untouched wilderness and the promise of a perfect shot. The hike to the overlook was more challenging than I anticipated. Our GPS kept losing signal, and the trail became harder to follow. Mark, unused to the wilderness, was slipping and cursing every few minutes. "Jason," he groaned, stopping to catch his breath. "Are you sure you know where we're going?" "It's a marked trail," I said, though I was starting to doubt myself. "Just keep moving." We were still debating when we met Amber. She emerged from the trees like she belonged there, her boots worn, her hair tied back in a messy braid. She looked like she'd been hiking for days. "Hi," she said, her voice friendly but cautious. "You two lost?" "No, just exploring," I said quickly. Amber raised an eyebrow. "You're heading into sacred ground?" Mark snorted. "Sacred? What, like ancient burial sites?" Amber's expression hardened. "Something like that. The Lakota believe this area is protected. It's not a place for tourists." "Good thing we're not tourists," I said, trying to keep the conversation light. I'm a photographer, just here for the scenery. She didn't seem convinced. Be careful, the Black Hills have their secrets. You don't want to upset the wrong thing. I laughed, unsure how to respond, but her words left a chill in the air. She turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving Mark shaking his head. Who does she think she is? Ghost Patrol? She's just trying to help, I said, though her warning lingered. I glanced at the darkening forest and picked up the pace. By the time we reached the campsite, the sun had dipped below the hills, casting long shadows across the clearing. I set up my camera, hoping to capture the golden hour, but my focus kept drifting to the forest. Something about it felt off. Mark sat by the fire, poking at the flames. This place is creepy, he muttered. Too quiet. He wasn't wrong. There were no birds, no insects, just an oppressive silence that wrapped around us like a shroud. I busied myself with the camera, reviewing footage from earlier. That's when I saw it. Something in the corner of the frame. A shadow, humanoid but distorted, standing just beyond the trees. I rewound the clip and zoomed in, but the figure dissolved into static. Everything okay? Mark asked, noticing my frown. Yeah, I lied, shutting off the camera. Just a glitch. The first howl came after midnight. It wasn't a wolf or coyote. I'd heard those before. This was deeper, guttural, like the earth itself was groaning. Mark bolted upright in his sleeping bag. What the hell was that? I grabbed the flashlight and scanned the forest. Probably just an animal. Yeah, an animal planning to eat us. Go back to sleep, I said, though I didn't believe my own words. The howling came again, closer this time. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. The next morning, I noticed tracks around the campsite. Large paw prints, too big for a wolf. They circled our tents and led into the forest, where they vanished abruptly. See? Mark said, pointing at the prints. I told you something's out there. It's probably a bear, I said, trying to stay calm. Let's focus on the hike. But Mark wasn't convinced. He kept glancing over his shoulder as we trekked deeper into the hills. By mid-afternoon, the tension was palpable. Why don't we just head back? He suggested. We're close to the overlook, I said, though I wasn't sure anymore. The trail had shifted somehow. Landmarks from the map were missing and the terrain felt unfamiliar. Mark groaned but followed. That's when the smell hit us, metallic and foul like rotting meat. Mark gagged, covering his nose. What is that? He asked. I don't know, I said, but my stomach churned. The forest felt alive, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. We returned to camp just before dusk, exhausted and uneasy. I reviewed the camera footage again, hoping to distract myself, but what I saw made my blood run cold. The shadow was back, clearer this time, a massive, hunched figure with glowing red eyes. It moved in jerky, unnatural bursts, watching us from the trees. Mark? I whispered, showing him the screen. His face paled. What? What is that? I didn't answer. My mind flashed back to Amber's warning. The Shunka Werakin, a guardian of sacred land, a predator. That night, the howling returned, accompanied by heavy footsteps circling the camp. The air was thick with the stench of decay. Mark grabbed a stick from the fire, his hands shaking. Whatever it is, it's close, he said. We need to stay calm, I said, though my heart was racing. Then it spoke. Mark, a voice called, eerily familiar. It sounded like mine, but distorted, stretched. "Mark, help me." Mark froze, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" "It's not me," I said. "Don't listen to it." The voice came again, closer. "Mark, I'm hurt. Come here." Mark bolted. I shouted after him, but he disappeared into the trees. I grabbed the flashlight and ran, the firelight fading behind me. I found Mark slumped against a tree, his breathing shallow. A shadow loomed over him. The Shunka Warakin. It was massive, its fur black as midnight, its eyes burning like embers. Its claws gleamed in the moonlight, and its growl vibrated through the earth. "Get away from him!" I shouted, swinging the flashlight. The light caught its face, twisted, skeletal with a mouthful of jagged teeth. It flinched, retreating into the shadows. I pulled Mark to his feet, half carrying him back to camp. Amber was waiting for us, her face pale but determined. She had returned to check on us and found the camp in disarray. "It's here, isn't it?" she said. I nodded, gasping for breath. "What do we do?" "We have to perform a ritual," she said. "It's the only way to appease it." Amber gathered items for an offering: stones, feathers, and a piece of cloth from Mark's backpack. She placed them in a circle, chanting under her breath. "Stay close," she said. "Don't let it separate us." The Shunka Warakin emerged as she finished the ritual. It stalked into the clearing, its eyes locked on us. Mark, still dazed, staggered forward, clutching a burning branch from the fire. "Get back!" he shouted, swinging the branch. The creature lunged, knocking him to the ground. I grabbed another torch, thrusting it between Mark and the beast. The flames danced in its eyes, and it snarled, retreating. Amber placed the offering at the edge of the clearing, her voice steady as she continued chanting. The Shunka Warakin hesitated, its growl deepening. Then, with a final roar, it vanished into the trees. We didn't waste time. Grabbing what we could, we ran to the RV, leaving the rest of our gear behind. The claw marks on the RV's side were a grim reminder of how close we'd come. As we drove away, Mark sat silently, his hands trembling. I glanced in the rearview mirror, my heart sinking. The Shunka Warakin stood on a distant ridge, its eyes glowing in the darkness. Some places aren't meant to be disturbed. The Black Hills keep their secrets, and I'll never set foot there again. The smell of pine and the distant sound of a babbling brook filled the air as we pulled the RV into a secluded clearing in Mount Hood National Forest. Sam insisted this spot was perfect, isolated, peaceful, and steeped in childhood memories. But something about the oppressive silence felt wrong. I shook it off as nerves. It had been years since the five of us, Sam, Dylan, Ava, Jordan, and me, had done something together. Sam had roped us all into this trip. 1 week to reconnect, he'd said, his excitement infectious. I agreed, though I wasn't sure what I hoped to reconnect with. The nostalgia of simpler times, our fading friendships, myself. "Let's set up," Sam called, his ranger voice commanding. The others groaned but complied, unloading gear while Dylan cracked jokes about bear attacks. As I helped Ava pitch a tent, I glanced into the dense forest surrounding us. The trees loomed tall, their dark branches swaying faintly in the breeze. Shadows flickered in the periphery of my vision, and I turned sharply, but saw nothing. The first signs came that night. We'd built a fire, laughing and teasing each other as we roasted marshmallows. Dylan had been in rare form, sneaking up behind Jordan with a stick to mimic a claw, sending him yelping into the dirt. Even Ava, ever the peacemaker, rolled her eyes at his antics. As the fire crackled, I noticed the sound of the forest had changed. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence, thick and unnatural. "Do you hear that?" I asked. Jordan cocked an eyebrow. "Hear what?" "Nothing. That's the point." Sam shrugged. "It's normal. Predators in the area can quiet things down. Probably a cougar nearby." I nodded, though my stomach twisted. It felt like something was watching us. I shivered and pulled my jacket tighter. When we finally crawled into the RV for the night, sleep came reluctantly. The wind rattled the trees, and I swore I heard faint laughter outside, high-pitched and distant, as if carried on the wind. I told myself it was my imagination, but when I woke at dawn, there were footprints in the dirt outside the RV. Too large to be one of ours. They circled the vehicle, stopping directly below my window. The second day brought more unease. We hiked to a nearby stream for water and stumbled across a rusty, weathered campsite. A decrepit tent leaned awkwardly against a tree, its fabric ripped to shreds. Inside, I found a single lantern, its glass cracked but strangely polished. "That's creepy," Ava said, stepping back. Dylan, of course, picked it up. "Cool. Free antique." "Leave it," Sam said firmly. "This place is abandoned for a reason." Dylan rolled his eyes but dropped the lantern. That night, as the fire dwindled, we spotted faint lights flickering deep in the woods. Lanterns. At first, we thought they were other campers, but the lights moved erratically, zigzagging between trees, sometimes too high for any person to hold. "Maybe locals?" Jordan suggested, though his voice wavered. Sam shook his head. "No one should be this far out." Dylan leaned closer to the fire, grinning. "Maybe it's ghosts." "Not funny," Ava snapped. We decided to call it a night, though none of us admitted how uneasy we felt. As I climbed into my sleeping bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that the lanterns were watching us. The third night brought the strangers. They appeared as we sat around the fire, unannounced and eerily quiet. A man and a woman, dressed in outdated hiking gear, wool jackets, high-waisted trousers, and leather boots. The man's face was pale, his eyes shadowed by the brim of his hat. The woman smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Mind if we join you?" the man asked. We hesitated. Sam, ever the ranger, gestured for them to sit. "Of course." They didn't say much, only stared at us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. When they finally left, I felt an immense relief, though I couldn't explain why. "What the hell was that about?" Jordan muttered. "Probably locals," Sam said, but his tone was unsure. The next morning, Ava screamed. Her backpack, which she'd left by the RV, was gone. In its place was an old canvas rucksack with frayed straps. Inside were vintage camping supplies, tin plates, a yellowed map of the forest, and a faded black and white photograph of campers smiling at the camera. Campers who looked suspiciously like the strangers from the night before. Dylan disappeared that night. He'd gone to gather firewood and hadn't come back. At first, we thought he was playing another prank, but an hour passed, then 2. We fanned out, calling his name. The lanterns appeared again, flickering in the distance. We followed them, hoping they'd lead us to Dylan, but they always stayed just out of reach. Finally, we found a clearing. The lanterns vanished as we approached, leaving behind a scene that turned my blood cold. There was a campsite, identical to the one we'd found earlier. The same ripped tent, the same lantern. and on the ground, scattered like breadcrumbs, were Dylan's belongings: his flashlight, his jacket, and his favorite baseball cap. "Dylan!" Ava shouted, her voice breaking. There was no response. The phantom's true nature. That night we realized the strangers weren't human. As we huddled in the RV, the lanterns reappeared, surrounding us in a perfect circle. Shadows moved between the trees, and then we heard it. Dylan's voice, calling weakly. "Help me!" Ava leapt for the door, but Sam grabbed her. "It's not him," he said, his voice shaking. The lanterns grew brighter, illuminating the figures standing outside. The strangers, now joined by more spectral figures, their faces pale and hollow. And there, among them, was Dylan, his eyes vacant, his body stiff as if he were a puppet on strings. "They're taking him," I whispered. "No," Sam said. "They already took him." We made a plan. Nina, always the pragmatist, realized her camera's flash could repel them. "Light hurts them," she said, showing us the photo she'd taken of the strangers earlier. Their forms were distorted, as if the camera had burned through their image. We waited until the phantoms drew closer, their lanterns casting eerie shadows across the RV. Then, with Nina's camera and makeshift torches, we made a break for it. The phantoms screamed as the light hit them, their forms flickering like faulty projections. We ran through the forest, the lanterns chasing us, until we found the main road. We never found Dylan. The rangers we reported to searched the area but found no trace of him, or the phantoms. When I developed the photos, I saw them again. The phantoms standing among the trees, their hollow eyes staring directly into the camera. And in the center of the group stood Dylan, holding a lantern. Sometimes, at night, I hear his voice, calling my name, asking for help. But I know better than to answer. I should have trusted my gut the moment Jason suggested Devil's Den for the camping trip. The name alone should have been enough of a warning. But Jason was persuasive, the kind of guy who could charm his way through anything, including my doubts. "It'll be fun, Olivia," he'd said with that easy grin of his. "We need to unplug, and this is the perfect place to do it. A couple of days out in the wild, some hikes, some beers. What's the worst that could happen?" Now I knew. The first signs of trouble were small, easy to dismiss. Bad tent poles, a broken flashlight, Eli, Jason's co-worker, muttering about bad vibes. We laughed it off, even Maya, who usually lived for a good sarcastic jab at Jason's expense. But the unease crept in, slow and insidious, like the fog that hung low in the valleys of Devil's Den. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sunlight slanting through the trees. The campsite Jason picked was remote. Prime real estate, he called it. Towering oaks surrounded the clearing, their gnarled branches casting skeletal shadows over the ground. I set up my sleeping bag in the tent and tried not to think about how isolated we were. By the time we got a fire going, the sun had dipped below the horizon. The air turned cold, sharp with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. We sat around the flames, the flickering light painting our faces in orange and gold. "So what's the deal with this place?" Maya asked, leaning back on her elbows. She sounded bored, but her eyes darted to the shadows beyond the firelight. Eli hesitated. He'd been quiet all evening, fiddling with his gear and avoiding eye contact. Now he looked up, his expression tense. "There's a story," he said. Jason groaned. "Here we go." "No, seriously," Eli pressed. "It's about a soldier from the Civil War, a deserter." He got caught hiding out here, and the locals, well, they didn't take kindly to cowards." Maya rolled her eyes. "Let me guess. They lynched him, and now his vengeful spirit haunts the woods?" Eli's mouth tightened. "Something like that. They say he was cursed, made to wander these woods forever. People see him sometimes, a shadow in the trees, red eyes glowing in the dark." Jason laughed, the sound loud and jarring against the quiet night. "Come on, Eli. You really believe that?" Eli didn't answer. He just stared into the fire, his face pale in the flickering light. The first night passed uneventfully, though I woke up several times to the sound of something moving outside the tent. Each time, I held my breath, listening to the rustle of leaves and the snap of twigs, but when I peeked out, there was nothing there. The next morning, we set out for a hike. Jason had mapped a route to a nearby cave system, eager to explore. The trail wound through dense woods, the trees pressing in on either side like a living wall. The air felt heavy, the kind of stillness that made your skin prickle. Maya lagged behind, swatting at mosquitoes and grumbling under her breath. "This is why I don't do nature," she muttered. We reached the caves by midday. The entrance yawned before us, a jagged black mouth in the limestone cliffs. Jason was the first to step inside, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. "Check this out," he called. The rest of us followed reluctantly. The air inside was cool and damp, the walls slick with moisture. It wasn't long before we saw them. Strange markings carved into the stone. Spirals and jagged lines, crudely etched but deliberate. "What do you think they mean?" I asked, running my fingers over one of the symbols. Eli's voice was tight. "They're warnings," Jason scoffed. "Warnings for what? Spooky ghosts?" Eli didn't reply. By the time we made it back to camp, the sun was sinking low in the sky. Dinner was a rushed affair, canned chili and stale crackers. The fire sputtered in the cool evening air, casting long, flickering shadows across the clearing. That's when the noises started. At first, it was subtle, a low, guttural cry echoing through the trees. Jason dismissed it as coyotes, but Eli looked uneasy, his eyes darting to the darkness. Then came the whispers. Soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I strained to make out the words, but they stayed just out of reach, slipping through my mind like water through a sieve. "What is that?" Maya asked, her voice tight. "Probably the wind," Jason said, though even he sounded unsure. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps. Not the steady crunch of boots on gravel, but something heavier, uneven, like a wounded animal dragging itself through the woods. Maya was gone. Panic shot through me, and I scrambled out of the tent, my heart hammering in my chest. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, staring into the trees. "Maya," I hissed, "what are you doing?" She didn't respond. I crept closer, the damp ground cold against my bare feet. When I touched her shoulder, she jerked back, her eyes wide and glassy. I don't know how I got here," she whispered. Before I could respond, a shadow moved at the edge of the firelight. Tall and thin, it loomed like a dark stain against the trees. Its eyes glowed red, twin pinpricks of malevolence that burned into my skull. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. The shadow didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching. The next morning, Eli was gone. We found his boots just outside the tent, the laces neatly untied. Tracks led into the woods, but they didn't make sense. Long, deep gouges in the dirt, as if something had dragged him away. Jason insisted we search for him, but the woods seemed to twist around us, the familiar landmarks shifting and disappearing. The air grew colder, sharper, and the whispers followed us wherever we went. By afternoon, Jason had had enough. "We're heading back to the RV," he said, his voice tight. "We'll call for help once we're out of here." But the trail was gone. No matter which direction we turned, we ended up back at the campsite. The clearing seemed smaller now, the trees pressing in like a cage. That night, the wraith came. It emerged from the shadows, its skeletal frame draped in tattered fabric that might once have been a uniform. Its face was a grotesque mask, hollowed cheeks and blackened teeth, its red eyes burning with an unnatural light. Jason grabbed a branch from the fire, brandishing it like a weapon. "Stay back!" he shouted. The wraith didn't flinch. It stepped closer, its movement slow and deliberate, its gaze fixed on Jason. "Leave us alone!" Jason swung the branch, the flames licking at the air. But the wraith moved faster than I thought possible, its skeletal hand shooting out to grip Jason's arm. Jason screamed, a sound I'll never forget, as the wraith's touch blackened his skin, spreading like ink through paper. He collapsed, convulsing on the ground as the wraith turned its gaze to me. I don't remember running. I don't remember dragging Maya back to the RV. All I know is that we didn't stop until the trees thinned and the dirt path turned to asphalt. We drove in silence, the whispers still echoing in my ears. Jason was never found. Neither was Eli. The rangers chalked it up to a tragic accident. People getting lost in the wilderness. It happens all the time. But I know better. Sometimes the wilderness doesn't let you leave. I've always been drawn to mysteries, but I never believed in the supernatural. Ghosts, demons, wendigos, those were stories, nothing more. Grace, my best friend since college, had the opposite mindset. She lived for the thrill of the unexplained. It's how we ended up at Devil's Kettle in northern Minnesota, a waterfall that split in two. One half flowed downstream, the other disappeared into a deep, inexplicable sinkhole. No one knows where the water goes. People have tried tracking it, dropping dye and ping-pong balls into the hole, but nothing ever reappears. The mystery made it the perfect stop for our road trip. We arrived late in the afternoon, the low sun casting golden light across the dense woods of Judge C.R. Magny State Park. Grace parked our aging sedan in the small lot near the trailhead, and we loaded up with camping gear. "You sure about this?" I asked as I shouldered my pack. The rangers said camping this close to the falls isn't recommended. "Emma," she said, flashing her usual mischievous grin, "since when have we listened to warnings?" She wasn't wrong. Grace had dragged me to abandoned hospitals, ghost towns, and more sketchy roadways than I could count. This time, though, something about the ranger's tone lingered. "Just don't get too close to the sinkhole," he'd warned, looking straight at Grace like he knew she'd ignore him. The hike was easy enough, 2 miles of well-worn trail cutting through towering pines and birches. The falls greeted us with a roar, mist rising as the water surged over the edge into the mysterious void. Grace stood on the overlook platform, leaning precariously over the rail. "Don't fall in," I said. She smirked. "What, you wouldn't jump in after me?" "Nope," I replied, deadpan. "I'd call your parents and tell them you were stupid enough to lean too far." We laughed, but as we set up camp near the falls, the humor faded. Something about the place felt wrong. The air had a heaviness to it, like a storm was coming, but the sky remained clear. The forest, too, was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the relentless roar of water. After dinner, we built a fire and sat talking about old times. Grace had her flashlight out, testing it, when the beam flickered and died. "Well, that's annoying," she muttered, shaking it. "Good thing you've got yours." "Maybe try not breaking your gear next time," I teased, tossing her a spare headlamp from my bag. We turned in not long after, the fire burning low. The night grew colder, and I woke shivering. I reached for my jacket, but something outside stopped me. Whispers, faint and distorted, like someone murmuring underwater. I froze, straining to listen. "Grace?" I whispered. Her steady breathing answered me. She was asleep. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they formed words. "Emma, come outside." I bolted upright. That voice, it was mine. I grabbed the flashlight and pointed it toward the tent flap, heart pounding. There was nothing there, just the dense wall of trees and the crackle of the dying fire. I lay awake the rest of the night, every shadow a threat. In the morning, Grace's hiking boot was missing. "You're joking, right?" she said, searching the area around the tent. "I left them right here." We eventually found it, hanging from a tree branch about 30 feet away. Neither of us had put it there. Grace brushed it off as a prank. I wasn't so sure. We hiked to the falls again, planning to photograph them in the early light. Grace, ever the daredevil, insisted on getting closer to the sinkhole. "This is a terrible idea," I said as she climbed over the protective railing. "It's fine. I'll be careful." She inched toward the edge, camera in hand, the roar of the falls drowning out my protests. Just as she leaned forward, her body jerked, like someone had pushed her. She screamed, scrambling back from the edge. I rushed to pull her up. "What happened?" I asked, breathless. I don't know," she stammered, shaking. "I swear, it felt like someone shoved me." The unease deepened as we hiked back to the campsite. The forest felt wrong, the air thick with decay. It was subtle at first, a faint, sour smell, but the farther we walked, the stronger it grew. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced we were being followed, though I never saw anything. That night, the whispers returned. This time, they were louder and unmistakable. "Emma," the voice called, dragging out my name. "Help me." It was Grace's voice. I sat up, heart hammering. "Grace?" I whispered, shaking her awake. She groaned, groggy and annoyed. "What?" she mumbled. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The voice came again, clear and insistent. "Emma, help me." It came from the direction of the falls. Grace heard it too this time. Her eyes widened. "What the hell?" We grabbed our flashlights and stepped out of the tent. The forest was still, the fire long dead. The voice called again, faint and distant. Against my better judgment, I followed it, Grace close behind. As we approached the falls, my flashlight caught something in the trees. A figure, tall and gaunt, with glowing yellow eyes. It was barely human, its limbs too long, its movements jerky. It watched us for a moment before disappearing into the shadows. "Did you see that?" Grace whispered. I nodded, unable to speak. My chest felt tight, like the air itself was pressing down on me. "We need to leave," I said finally. "Now." Grace didn't argue. We packed up in silence, every snap of a twig making me flinch. As we made our way back to the trailhead, the thing followed us. I'd catch glimpses of it in the trees, always just out of reach, its glowing eyes searing into me. Halfway back, Grace vanished. I turned around to say something, but she was gone. "Grace?" I called, panic rising. No answer, just the roar of the falls and that damn smell of decay. I searched the area, yelling her name. Finally, I spotted her jacket hanging from a low branch. It was torn and bloodied. My stomach dropped. "Emma," her voice called from deeper in the woods. It sounded wrong, too high, too distorted. I followed it, desperate, until I found her, sitting by the fire back at our campsite. "Grace?" I asked cautiously. She didn't respond, just stared into the flames. Her movements were stiff, unnatural. When I circled around to face her, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't Grace. Its face was skeletal, skin stretched impossibly thin. Its eyes glowed yellow, and when it smiled, its teeth were jagged and too many. I ran. Branches tore at my clothes as I barreled through the forest, heading for the parking lot. The thing was behind me, its footsteps crunching closer, its voice calling my name in Grace's tone. "Emma, come back," it said, laughing. "Don't leave me." I tripped, falling hard. When I looked up, the thing was standing over me, its hollow face inches from mine. I screamed, fumbling for my flashlight. Desperation took over, and I grabbed a dry branch from the ground, lighting it with a match from my pocket. The flame flared to life, and the thing hissed, recoiling. Its eyes burned brighter as it backed away, disappearing into the shadows. I didn't stop running until I reached the parking lot. A lone car drove by, and I flagged it down, sobbing as I climbed inside. "What happened?" the driver asked. I couldn't answer. My mind was stuck on the image of Grace's jacket, torn and bloodied, and the thing that had worn her face. As the car pulled away, I glanced back at the forest. Grace was standing there at the edge of the trees, her eyes glowing yellow, her lips curled into a smile. Even now, days later, I can feel it watching me. In crowded streets in my apartment at night, I hear her voice calling my name. And sometimes, just sometimes, I see glowing eyes in the darkness, waiting for me to return to Devil's Kettle.